Hello, everyone, and welcome to MuniciPality, a podcast exploring the wonders of local government through discussions and special guests. This is Adrian, and I have Natalia with me for today's episode. To learn more about us and the entire MuniciPality team, listen to our first mini episode called Meet the Neighbors, and last week's episode called COVID and Local Government. Now, we want to welcome you back to our community to discuss a difficult and timely topic, the history and future of policing in the United States. We would like to begin with a moment of silence for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Gardner, and all other people who have been killed by police officers. Thank you. Now, Natalia, can you give us an overview of the origins of policing?
So, for this episode, I did some research and looked into kind of the beginnings of policing in the United States. And the existence of cops as a career path is actually less than 100 years old, which I didn't know, which was interesting to find out because I feel like when people talk about police and policing in the United States, they talk about it as if it's an institution as old as humankind has ever, been. So it's interesting to know that cops are actually not necessarily been a profession for very long. And initially, kind of the beginnings of policing and police officers were night watches in, colonial America. Obviously, there were people here before in the Americas, but the beginning of policing didn't really, in the way that we know it, didn't really start until obviously people from Europe came over. And so it really didn't work out well, though, the night watches. Often people would get drunk or sleep, and it was often used as a punishment in some cases. And the stigma was so great that people wouldn't actually wear their badges. And later, to try to improve the night watch, they tried to make it a compulsory service and mandatory for individuals to serve as a night watch person for at least some period of time. But often, if you had enough money, you would pay someone of a lower class to do that job for you, and often they would pay criminals to do that work, which is very counterproductive. The first full-duty force was in 1883 in Boston. It was done for the protection of property and shipped goods. It was kind of like merchants' own personal security guards. And they actually convinced many of the citizens of Boston that it would actually be a benefit for the collective good, and made it possible to transfer the essential private payment of these private companies to the government and the tax-paying, citizens, because they believed it was a collective good and would protect and improve the quality of life, even though essentially these early on police forces only protected the shipped goods and the property. In the South, it developed as slave patrols and to prevent, slaves from running away to the North and to, get their freedom. And during the Civil War, the military stepped in local areas and local sheriffs after the war to enforce segregation and disenfranchisement of freed slaves in the South. So, to summarize, kind of in the North, it was used for the protection of goods, and in the South, it was used to continuously kind of maintain Black Americans in a lower class citizen status to make sure that they weren't able to do the normal freedoms of most Americans in the South.
Wow, that's a really interesting history. Thanks for sharing, Addie. Now, can you talk about how politics has further influenced the development of the police?
So, politics didn't really become involved in policing until the 19th century, where businessmen with connections to politicians influenced the creation of police forces out of the fear of immigrants like the Irish and, Italians at that point, and of the labor unions. And very quickly at that point, major cities across the country started developing these police forces. And political machines often appointed the political captains and the sergeants, which would allow many politicians to get away with crimes and harass political opponents. This would change under Prohibition and President Hoover with the Wickersham Commission in 1929, which investigated the issues of law enforcement nationwide. Their solution was to make police independent from political parties by making sure policing precincts and political wards did not line up, to try to break up that potential corruption that was brewing between police officers and politicians.
Natalia, could you talk more about how police have interacted with marginalized communities in the United States, specifically Native American communities and Black communities?
So, when looking at Native American communities, it's really hard to have a lot of accurate data. There isn't really a lot of data on how these communities are policed, and it it ranges widely, obviously depending on how big different territories are, and so it often is broken, and in their relationship between the police officers lacks like a true sense of partnership because they don't really work together very well, and often these communities have 55 to 75% of the resources that other communities have, leading to many of the issues that are underlying that often underlying issues that lead to crime that often can lead into arrest, but also, policing isn't really dealing with the root cause of many of these communities. And so it's difficult to say how deep the problems are with policing in Native American communities, but it's, I would say, safe to say that the lack of resources in these communities have pushed them towards potentially criminal behavior because of the lack of resources and lack of like allocation of resources specifically to these communities, which has been historic. And then looking into Black communities in the US, obviously there's still a lot of segregation that even exists today. And a lot of policing was kind of surrounded around the broken window theory, that the idea that if there's a broken window or a cosmetic issue in a community, it could indicate that there was deep rooted issues or lead to even more crime. And this is obviously associated mostly with Black communities because of the lack of investment in these communities. It's not that these communities are necessarily like always more broken or have more cosmetic issues or necessarily even have more crimes, but like these are assumptions that are based off of a system and a culture that has kind of been designed against Black people since the beginning of the United States. And so policies like in the past, like foot patrol, have been implemented because even though they have no effects on crime, but made it seem more safe. And so there's a lot of policing that has been done in Black communities based off of our prejudice and not necessarily to improve the safety of the community.
Thanks for the insight, Natalia. I've heard many people think that Black communities are more policed because they're more dangerous or have more crime, like some of what you were saying, but there's obviously something else going on. Could you explain more about that?
Yeah, for sure. It's really difficult to say such a conclusive statement that Black communities are objectively have more crime because it really depends on the type of crime you look at. I think a very common example now today with the legalization of marijuana and mass incarceration with many Black Americans and white, but mostly Black Americans that are still incarcerated for marijuana crimes from decades past. And so with the data we have, like whites and blacks use marijuana at the same rate, but blacks are 4 times as likely to be arrested. And we often put more police officers in Black communities because of the assumption that they are more likely to have criminal activities. But in reality, obviously, if you have more police officers investigating, much like we saw in Stop and Frisk, just because they were searching more Black people, there was a chance that they were more likely to find them carrying weed or something else incriminating. And so obviously if you search more often and have more presence there, you're going to find more crime. And so another example of crime that isn't really documented is wage theft. Wage theft is, simply put, basically when an employer takes money that should be going to the employee. And this over time can amount to thousands. This type of crime overall, they said in 2012, which I know is a little bit outdated, but said is over $50 billion in losses, whereas all kind of the crimes that we assume police officers deal with, like robberies, burglaries, larcenies, motor vehicle thefts, in the entire U.S. cost to victims less than $14 billion. And so the difference between those kinds of crimes that police officers are often in charge of dealing with in the long run have a much smaller economic impact on the community. And so the thing is, these are obviously crimes that aren't really going to be policed. And so you think about what is more dangerous to a community, to the United States, a $14 billion loss or a $50 billion loss. And it puts it into perspective that, Black communities have been historically over-policed because of obviously the racist history that we've talked about. And I'm not trying to say that all police officers are racist or holding up racist values that they personally have, but it's impossible to say that police have not enforced in the past laws that have been racist. And so it's important to note that also the presence of police officers helping these communities that are also potentially driven to crime because of the lack of opportunity, and that obviously over-policing is going to lead to the increased finding of crime. And so it's not because there's more negative crime or more crime present there. It's just a collection of a lot of other underlying issues. And so I think that's also important to note when we talk about policing.
Can you talk about what some of the roadblocks to change in these issues are today?
I would say today, people now, after seeing what events happened after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, that police unions are a huge issue, because we see police unions aggressively defending police officers in the face of misconduct and repeated misconduct. Basically police unions now have labor laws that are basically just placed on police officers with little change, even though labor laws are designed for people manufacturing cars versus people who get to protect communities and hold weapons. And so obviously, if I mess up, making a car and I accidentally get paint somewhere that I wasn't supposed to, or I maybe injure someone versus potentially killing someone with a gun or causing damage to a community in that kind of way, are two different things and should be treated as two different things. And so obviously those labor protection laws shouldn't be applied equally to police officers, but they are. Top prosecutors across the U.S. have promised reform time and time again, especially after an event like the murder of George Floyd. But ultimately, it's very difficult to make these changes for many prosecutors. Robert Bruno, a professor of labor relations at the University of Illinois, believes that the mentality that police officers have about protecting one another is because they have this feeling of authority and feel that, they're kind of cut out after one mistake. And so there's this sense of absolute loyalty to each other and a willingness to protect even when there's a huge amount of evidence piling up against potentially their coworker that this may not be the correct job for them. There's this sense of authority, but also loyalty to each other, that they need to protect each other and that the world is against them. If they make one mistake, they're out, which I think is understandable, but is, if you make a mistake and you kill someone, it's different than obviously the other labor union protection laws. And so there has been a lot of effort by many politicians to make reform, but it's difficult to create impactful change because basically police unions have a huge bargaining chip, being the fact that they are a union. And so they may, agree to some small reform like body cameras or something like that. And then actually after that, violence may increase because they obviously have won with their bargaining, and the changes are often minimal because politicians are fighting so much for very little improvement. But that's enough about the history of policing, and I would love to hear, what you guys think about this. And obviously, if you guys have any facts that obviously I missed out on because I couldn't research the entire history of policing, so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. But enough about the history of policing. I think we should talk about where policing is going and the potential policy changes that are, being suggested and trying to change in this country. And so, Adrian, can you tell us the different policy options for how to deal with the flaws and problems with policing? Do you have any examples?
Of course. Given this history and ongoing police violence in the United States, and of course widespread protests in response to the murders of George Floyd and others, it is evident that change must come. But what should change look like? Well, today I'm going to give an overview of some proposed solutions that fall under the categories of police reform and police abolition. So the first option many people consider to address police brutality is police reform. Natalia talked a little bit about this before, but some of the reforms that are happening now include schools and universities, including the University of Minnesota and Minneapolis Public Schools, cutting contracts with police departments. At the University of Minnesota, that meant sticking only with their in-house police department, the university's police department, which they see as potentially easier to make reforms to in order to best serve students. So this is another step that universities across the country could take to make sure that they have law enforcement that is specific to their university that will be protecting students and not getting folks further involved with a larger justice system when it is not necessary. Another potential solution is problem-oriented policing. This also falls under reform, and the term problem-oriented policing was originally coined by the University of Wisconsin professor Herman Goldstein. So, POP for short, problem-oriented policing, instead of focusing on punishing people who commit crimes, instead focuses on police proactively identifying underlying problems in the community, which can be targeted to reduce crime and disorder at their roots. So the idea behind the strategy is kind of similar to that of police abolition, which I'll talk about later, but this maintains a traditional police force and then works with that force to address the underlying causes of crime. So this idea has been popular in the past among police administrators, but often doesn't really have poorly defined goals. So it can lead to discontent among rank and file police officers who just feel like their job is being expanded beyond traditional law enforcement to being community support in a variety of other sectors. So the implementation of this must be done carefully in order to make sure that that administrators are keeping police officers along the goals that they would like to achieve. So another option folks have presented is the public health approach to public safety. This is kind of like a general lens for looking at policing and public safety in general, but basically both public health and the policing sectors are often tasked with preventing and responding to violence. So this concept basically proposes that we expand collaboration between public health and police. So data from the U.S. Department of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey, for example, which is conducted from 2006 to 2010, revealed that more than 1/2 of all violent incidents in the United States were not reported to law enforcement. Essentially, people did not report because of perception that the police are unwilling or unable to help, or fear of reprisal by the offender. For example, at my university, and I'm sure at many others, a lot of folks who are victims of sexual assault don't report to the police. They only go to a healthcare provider because they either know or fear that the police won't actually take any action against the person who assaulted them, and will instead just make a logistical kind of nightmare, frankly, for folks to get through having to tell their story over and over again. So that often happens because of like a lack of trust in the policing system. So the idea of public health approach to public safety in this situation would work with the police and with the public health sector to address the problem of sexual assault by making sure that there's like data shared and collaboration between the police and healthcare folks, so that they can prevent violence on all fronts, and the police can have a more accurate view of like when sexual assaults are occurring, and other problems. But that's just an example that I think is particularly salient for me and other folks my age. So a couple other examples for times when this can happen is, for example, in Minneapolis, there's the Office of Violence Prevention and a variety of domestic violence prevention programs. So those two kind of examples would also be times when, instead of just punishing criminals, folks are working to promote the health of the community as a whole, with a variety of methods. Another campaign that has become kind of popular on social media recently is the 8 Can't Wait campaign. It basically proposes 8 key reforms that they think that a lot of folks think are necessary to prevent a vast majority of police violence and deaths by the police in the United States. So the reforms that this campaign proposes include banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring a warning before shooting, exhausting all alternatives before shooting, duty to intervene, which basically means that if a police officer sees another officer engage in police brutality, that they have to stop that person, ban shooting at moving vehicles, require use of force continuum, and comprehensive reporting, which basically means that police officers need to properly report every time that they use force against a resident of the community. So those are generally the 8 reforms. There's a lot of small pieces behind all of them that you can look at more in some of the links in the description of this episode. But I'll talk to you all a bit about what the communities that have these are like right now. Minneapolis actually has 4 of these, or had 4 of these in place already at the time of George Floyd's death. Minneapolis did a lot of police reform following the 2014-2015 Black Lives Matter protests, and actually tried pretty hard to do police reform at the time. And obviously that didn't prevent the deaths of George Floyd and countless other incidents of police brutality. So there's clearly still more work to do in our community. Furthermore, Washington, D.C. and Madison, Wisconsin, which are the 2 college towns of Natalia and I, have 7 out of these 8 policies in place. And there's obviously still distrust between the police and the community in those cities, and continuing police brutality. especially during the protests, which I've seen firsthand in Madison, and heard from folks repeatedly that there's obviously still police brutality going on there. Furthermore, Chicago has 6 out of these 8 in place. LA has 5 out of the 8. So these reforms do exist in a lot of places already that still continue to have issues with police brutality. So they're not a catch-all. And actually, Campaign Zero apologized for their 8 Can't Wait campaign, which they said unintentionally distracted from efforts of fellow organizers invested in paradigmatic shifts that are newly possible in this moment. So basically, the 8 Can't Wait campaign is promoting a lot of these reforms that now their like founding organization basically says we can move beyond, but they're something that a lot of municipalities have done as a first step.
Thank you for sharing that important information, Adrian, and that important context. But following George Floyd's murder, how have policy ideas changed?
Well, that's really interesting, actually. The 8 Can't Wait campaign was promoted a lot, and a lot of the other police reforms were like initially jumped on, but then obviously folks knew that a lot of these reforms kind of came up 5 years ago or so, and these things are still happening. And communities that even have reformed the police departments a lot still continue to have problems with the police. So many progressives, including the Minneapolis City Councilmember Philippe Cunningham, have long advocated for more money to go into non-police anti-violence work. And since George Floyd, there's been a massive growth in the movement to defund or abolish the police. For example, in direct response to the 8 Can't Wait campaign kind of came this movement called 8 to Abolition. But what would it mean to abolish the police? I mean, obviously, many people who hear about this for the first time, including me, are confused and scared by the concept of a police-free community. But when I recall the fear and anxiety that I know many Black and non-Black people of color experience when interacting with the police, I see a reason to consider the option of abolition. So I'm going to be going into that now. In general, police abolition relies on developing strong social and community programs to prevent people from wanting or needing to commit crimes. This might not seem like a perfect solution, but the system we have right now is far from perfect. It's important to remember that people are still robbed, assaulted, and murdered every day, even though our communities are filled with police. And alongside that, there are so many people arrested for drug possession, sex work, homelessness, or even the symptoms of mental illness, and the criminal justice system rarely helps them. So the abolition movement proposes that community-based drop-in centers and social workers should address these kind of problems for community instead of throwing people behind bars. So furthermore, by abolishing or defunding police departments, municipalities can spend more on addressing the root causes of crime, many of which stem from poverty. And when they do that, they can also take a variety of police officers off the street and help people of color to feel more safe in their communities, especially Black people. Furthermore, abolition likely would not happen all at once, so the smaller yet very impactful victories along the way include taking police out of schools, as Minneapolis has already done since the death of George Floyd. This is just one way that we can decrease the interactions between police and people who don't really need to be put in jail. For example, in schools, when students act out, counselors and restorative justice programs could restore peace in the school instead of an armed police officer. Furthermore, public health professionals, social workers, and nonprofit leaders, psychologists, and other experts would work to develop prevention strategies specific to the community to address all the other problems that people might usually rely on police for. For example, if a drunk or ill person is causing a disruption in public, instead of being arrested, a response team trained in violence prevention could help them get home or to a hospital. There are countless other examples that you can find online of how communities can keep themselves safe after police have been abolished, but I'm not going to go into all those right now. But basically, in times when people have been trained to rely on the police, the abolition movement seeks more creative ways of maintaining safety so that residents don't need to be afraid of the people who are supposed to be protecting and serving them. So in summary, reform will likely not end police brutality, but it could increase community trust and lead to more productive violence prevention and health promotion efforts. And police abolition would be politically difficult in many municipalities, and it probably will be in Minneapolis, though they're starting to work on it right now. But through creative problem solving, police abolition does present the possibility of safer and healthier communities in the future. If you want to learn more about these visions for the future of policing, please check out the links in the description of this episode. This conversation is far from over, and obviously there are many ideas for what the future of police could look like that I have not outlined here. So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, or feel free to reach out to me on social media as well.
Yeah, and so thank you for letting us talk about this. And so obviously, please reach out on social media, which our links will be in the description, to continue this conversation, because obviously this is just the research and insight of two individuals, and there's, so much more out there to learn about. And so also for next week, we'll be discussing the recent protests in the United States. So get excited for that. And we just wanted to thank you guys all again for stopping by this week, and we hope to see you in our municipality soon. Thank you guys.